The Assyrians built the first empire in human history, developed the first military intelligence network, the first postal system, and the first libraries, and then vanished so completely that for 2,000 years the world forgot they had ever existed until archaeologists dug up their cities in the 19th century. Scientists have now tested ancient Assyrian DNA, and the results don't map cleanly onto any modern population. So the question worth asking is this: where did the people who essentially invented the concept of empire actually come from? And where did they go? 3,000 years ago, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, from the mountains of Iran to the coast of the Mediterranean. It was the largest empire the world had seen to that point, administered through a system of governors, roads, and relay messengers that would not be matched in organizational sophistication for centuries. Its capital, Nineveh, on the banks of the Tigris in what is now northern Iraq, held a population of over 100,000 people at a time when most of the world lived in scattered villages. Its king, Ashurbanipal, built the first systematically organized library in human history, collecting tens of thousands of clay tablets covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and law, including the oldest written version of the flood narrative that would later appear in the book of Genesis. Then, in 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes attacked Nineveh, burned it to the ground, and the Assyrian Empire collapsed with a speed that still puzzles historians. Within 20 years of that destruction, the empire that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries had ceased to exist as a political entity. The cities were buried under sand. The language faded. The people scattered. And for the next 2,000 years, the Assyrians existed primarily as a villain in the Hebrew Bible, the destroyers of the northern kingdom of Israel, the empire that deported entire populations, until 19th century archaeologists began digging in northern Iraq and found the physical remains of a civilization so large and so sophisticated that its rediscovery genuinely shocked the Western academic world. The question of Assyrian origins has never been fully resolved. The Assyrians spoke a Semitic language related to Babylonian and distantly to Hebrew and Arabic. And for most of the 20th century, this linguistic connection was taken as sufficient evidence that they were simply a northern branch of the broader Semitic-speaking population of the ancient Near East. But language is not genetics, and when ancient DNA research began reaching into Mesopotamian archaeological sites, the results introduced complications that the linguistic model alone could not account for. Ancient DNA extracted from sites in the northern Mesopotamian region associated with Assyrian populations reveals a genetic profile that draws from multiple ancestral streams in proportions that do not straightforwardly match any modern population. There are components related to early Anatolian farmers, components associated with populations from the Caucasus and Iranian plateau, and components linked to the earlier Natufian hunter-gatherers of the Levant. This mixture is not itself surprising. The ancient Near East was a region of continuous population movement and admixture across millennia. What is significant is the specific configuration and the degree to which it diverges from both the modern populations of the region and from the neighboring ancient populations with whom the Assyrians are most often grouped. The Assyrians of the imperial period, the people who built Nineveh and Nimrud and Khorsabad, show a genetic signature that suggests they were not simply a local development from the earlier populations of northern Mesopotamia. There are ancestral components in the Assyrian genetic profile that point toward movement from the north and east, from regions of the Caucasus and the Iranian highlands, at a period preceding the formation of the Assyrian state. This means that the people who became the Assyrians were themselves the product of a population mixture that had largely resolved by the time the historical record begins, leaving a combined genetic profile that then remained relatively stable across the centuries of imperial expansion. What the DNA does not show is equally significant. The Assyrian genetic profile does not reflect the large-scale population movements that characterized the region after the empire's fall. The Arab expansion of the 7th century AD, the Turkic migrations of the medieval period, the various waves of population movement that reshaped the genetic landscape of the Middle East across the last 2 millennia. This means that the ancient Assyrian genetic signature, distinctive as it is, was substantially diluted and overwritten by later demographic events. The configuration that made the ancient Assyrians genetically distinct from their neighbors does not survive intact in any modern population. There is, however, a community that has carried the Assyrian name continuously from antiquity to the present day. The Assyrian Christians, also known as Chaldeans or Syriacs depending on denominational affiliation, are a community of approximately 3 to 4 million people dispersed across Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and diaspora communities in Europe, the United States, and Australia. They speak Neo-Aramaic, a descendant of the language that replaced Assyrian as the administrative tongue of the Near East in the late 1st millennium BC. They have maintained a continuous ethnic and religious identity through the Parthian and Sassanid empires, through the Islamic conquests, through the Mongol invasions, and through the genocides of the early 20th century that reduced their numbers catastrophically. Genetic studies of modern Assyrian Christians show that they carry a component of ancient Near Eastern ancestry that is relatively less diluted by the later population movements that reshaped their neighbors. They cluster genetically closer to ancient Levantine and Mesopotamian populations than do most modern Arab or Turkish populations of the same geographic region. This does not mean they are direct linear descendants of the ancient Assyrian Empire's population in any simple sense. 2,500 years of history, intermarriage, conversion, and population movement have inevitably produced a complex genetic picture. But it does mean that the modern Assyrian community carries a thread of ancient Near Eastern genetic continuity that is genuinely distinctive, and that their claim to historical connection with the ancient civilization is not merely cultural but has a measurable biological dimension.
The discontinuity between ancient and modern is still real and still significant. The specific genetic configuration of the imperial Assyrian population, the particular mixture of Caucasus-related, Iranian-related, and Levantine ancestries in their specific proportions, does not appear in any modern group in that exact form. What survives is a partial signal, attenuated by time and demographic change, present most strongly in the modern Assyrian Christian community, but not identical to it. Their DNA tells a story of origins that the historical record never fully captured. A mixing of peoples from the mountains and the highlands and the river valleys that produced, for a few centuries, something the ancient world had not seen before and would not see again in quite that form.